This tank here is probably one of the most single recognisable tanks of the entire Cold War. It has a low silhouette and still to this day forms the backbone of the Russian army, as well as many armies like it. With over 20,000 units made of all models, the Soviet T-72 is one of the greatest tanks of all time. Although being easily destroyed by the M1 Abrams and other anti-tank platforms in recent wars, the T-72 remains as a cheap and viable option for any army, still to this day. We begin our story on the T-72 with the T-62. The T-62 and T-64 were both tanks that had many similarities to the later T-72, however there were many issues. Both T-62 and T-64 were extremely expensive for Soviet standards. The T-62 was brought into service with the Bulgarian military, and the T-64 was denied by the Soviet Russia's allies within the Warsaw Pact. Even when the T-64 was still in development, a new, cheaper alternative was being planned. In the Ural Wagon Zavod, Nizhny Tagil, the designers came up with a new, much more economic design. It was primarily based upon the V64 and was originally drawn by the chief engineer Leonid Kotsev as the Object 172 and further refined by Valery Vendiktov and was renamed as the Object 172M. It began trials in 1971 and these went on until 1973. In that year, the tank was accepted to be put into production in the tank factory at Chelyabinsk, who had previously made the T-54s and 55s, who began to change their production lines in preparation for the T-72. Since then, the T-72 has been delivered yearly, for every year right up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The design of the T-72 was reasonably small and straightforward. It had a very low hull and a maximum height of just over 2 meters. Compared to most Western MBTs, the T-72 is extremely low and small. This was considered a weakness, as crew comfort and the size of crew compartments were deemed to be very important in Western tank design. However, it was seen that on Soviet MBTs, there was limited space to keep the overall silhouette down. The Western MBTs often thought of the crew and how they needed space to operate, as well as their tanks lasting much longer. The T-72 was fitted with an autoloader. It hastened the reload rate of the tank to a consistent speed and also eliminated the need for a dedicated loader. While this might be great from a combat perspective and also a design perspective, it was a kind of a disadvantage. The thing is, when you remove a crew member, great, there's one less person to train. However, that does mean there's one less crew member that could help tension the tracks, do maintenance, help look for targets and many more. This is probably one of the reasons why NATO tanks, such as the Leopard A1a1 and M60, have no autoloader, and a dedicated crew member for the loader. That's it for now for the autoloader. This might get a bit long and tedious. Let's move on. The engine was originally an HV12, but it could still propel the T-72 to a maximum speed of 60 km an hour. It was still pretty fast. By Western standards, the engine was pretty weak, only having around 780 horsepower. Germany's Leopard 1, however, had 830 horsepower. However, the overall size of the T-72 reduced the weight and the factor of being underpowered by NATO standards. The V12 engine was originally designed for the T-34, the workhorse for the Soviet Army in the Second World War for the Great Patriotic War. Similar variations for the engine were used in the T-34, 55 and 62. Coupled to the engine was the Synchromesh hydraulically assisted 7-speed transmission with one reverse gear. T-72s that were made after the beginning of the 80s had been upgraded to a 840 horsepower V84 diesel engine. The suspension was of torsion bar style with dampers on front and rear road wheels. Road wheels that were fitted had rubber on the outside layer. These were redesigned road wheels, unlike the T-64, and were partially hollow and also made from steel. The tracks were simplified, like older models, unlike the T-64s. The T-72 hull was mainly constructed out of RHA, or Rolled Homogeneous Armour. NBC, nuclear, biological or chemical, protection was a big factor of the T-72 as it was the age of the Cold War, where nuclear warfare was a massive threat. Therefore, tanks would need to be capable of performing effectively whilst under hazardous environments. There were synthetic fibres made out of boron, which lined the insides of the tank and reduced the amount of external gases from coming into the tank. There was also an air filter system which incorporated safety valves and the constant pressure. These helped reduce the amount of harmful gases from entering the tank, but not all of them. The shell casing ejection system for the autoloader would have to draw in air, which wasn't too good. The optics were reasonable but not astounding, and were actually quite limited. The addition of the autoloader resulted in the turret to be much smaller than its previous models, like the T-62 and 55. The commander's cupola was positioned to the rear right of the turret, and it had 4 vision blocks and 1 periscope. The gunner's position was situated to the left of the commander's position, on the left side of the turret. He had a 1 main periscope and 2 additional vision blocks. Getting the range for the targets under 1,000 meters on the earlier models was tricky, as it was pure guesswork. Above 1,000 kilometers, the parallax rangefinder could be used. On exports, this piece of equipment was deemed to be too expensive, so only the Commander or K variants got it. There was also a night vision equipment, which was standardized in the 2000s, however it is not seen on export models. The armor on the turret was pretty decent. On the vertical sections of the turret cheeks, there were hollow spaces filled with sand. American intelligence nicknamed this Dolly Parton. The thickness of the area is probably around 380mm thick at 1,000 kilometers on the T-72, and against APFSDS rounds on modern versions of the T-72, like the B3, can withstand 770mm to 800mm, and against HEAT-FS, 490 to 990mm. The later T-72s have one of the best protection levels for Soviet-era tanks. Despite its size compared to its NATO counterparts, the T-72 has an extremely potent 125mm 2A46 gun, capable of delivering HEAT-FS or Sabre rounds every 7 seconds. The T-72 could also fire ATGMs, or anti-tank guided missiles. The ATGMs could be ideally used from 1,800 meters. Due to the size of the turret, vertical guidance was very limited, only having -6 to 13 degrees of elevation and depression. The gun had a bore excavator around halfway through the barrel, and like most T-72s, have a thermal sleeve covering the whole barrel. The stabilizers on the early T-72s were of an average standards and could keep the gun relatively on target, but it was often for a T-72 to stop and fire. It was accompanied by the lunar infrared illuminator. In order for the autoloader to place the shell in the breech, it had to elevate the gun to 3 degrees. Spent shell casings weren't left in the tank until the end of the engagement, but were ejected through the roof of the tank. There was a 7.62 PKT coax in the gun manlet, and a 12.7 NSVT heavy machine gun on the commander's cupola, although the turret-mounted heavy machine gun was intended to be used for primarily against aircraft. But this became unnecessary, as in the Vietnam War, the only devoted piston-propelled ground attack aircraft was the A1 Sky Raider, and other aircraft such as the subsonic A4 and Mach 2 capable F4 were much faster than their piston-engined compatriots. This meant that hitting an aircraft even as big as the F4 or F105 meant extreme skill, hindered by the shorter range of the heavier machine gun. However, the use of helicopters changed this view, as attack helicopters, fitted with tow or hot missiles, became a serious threat. This gun was also used against softer targets like smaller trucks and infantry. Now enough of the history, now on to the variants of the T-72. The first production variant of the T-72 was released in 1973 as the T-72 Ural. This was ultimately derived from the Object 172M and was armed with the D81 TM 125mm gun, as well as the searchlight mounted to its left. The TPD 249 optical rangefinder sight was added at a later stage. There were also some T-72 Urals modified with powerful radio sets for the commander tank. These were exported under the designation of Object 172M-E1 and were often given to Russian allies and nations of the Warsaw Pact, such as Poland, Iraq and Syria. These were simplified and were only given 44 rounds. Some of these were modified in the 70s to the Object 172-2M Buffalo and the T-72 Ural-1, with reworked turret armour. Some of these were given ERA in the form of Contact 1, designated the T-72V. These were designated V, however, in English this meant explosive. In the 80s, the searchlight was relocated to the right-hand side of the gun. The next major modification of the T-72 was done in 1979 and was the T-72A, which had a greater field of protection. The T-72A also had a searchlight in different position to the T-72 Ural and had an improved electrical fire control system, smoke launchers, Dolly Parton composite armour on the front and top of the turret, as well as various internal changes. The commander variants were designated the T-72 AK1, 2 or 3. In 1979, a new 17mm high-resistance steel plate was used on the Glacier's applique armour. However, in the 1980s, Contact 1 ERA made a standard on the T-72 AV. Next up was the T-72 AM. Usually this would mean a modernisation process, such as the T-55 AM or T-62M. However, this model was for the export market. The NATO code name for this modification was Monkey. As to usual export standards, they were reduced in complexity. Nations of the Warsaw Pact, such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, produced these modifications. The T-72 MK1, 2, 3 were command variants. The T-72 M1 was an export T-72 built to the T-72A 1979 standards. It had extra smoke discharges, and the T-72 M1M was an upgraded to the T-72B standards. The next step after the T-72A was the T-72B, released in 1985. It was further improved, yielding a composite reinforced turret in the top and front, known as Dolly Parton in the west. It also had applique armour in the glacis. It had a new 1A40-1 fire control system and a 9K120 laser rangefinder, which was needed to fire the 8M119 barrel-launched ATGM, as well as a new stabilizer system. A new engine was also fitted, as well as different position of smoke discharges and frontal ERA protection. The latest modification to the T-72 is the 2016 model of the T-72B3, or T-72B3 UBH, which has the improved and more powerful 1130 horsepower engine, a new stabilizer, and rear kit protection and ERA. The hull and turret sides are covered with anti-heat screens. In the Cold War, the T-72 was the bulk of the Soviet armoured force. In the Soviet-Afghan War, the Soviets used more expendable T-55s and T-62s. However, in 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, there were still over 4,000 in reserve. The older variants of the T-72 have been placed with the T-90, whilst others have been upgraded to T-90 standard, such as T-72B3. The first use of T-72s in combat was in 1982, with forces of Syria in the south of Lebanon, fighting against Israeli M60A1s and Merkavas. With almost no losses against the M60s, the Syrian Brigade from the 1st Armoured Division only came across trouble when hidden TOW ATGMs were able to ambush them. In the Iran-Iraq War of 1980, T-72s fought against Chieftains, M48s and M60s. A single battalion claimed to have destroyed an entire Iranian unit armed with Chieftains. The T-72 also played a large role in the Battle of Basura and proved to be almost frontally immune to TOW ATGMs, RPGs and the 105mm guns on the M60s. Only 60 T-72s were lost in the 8-year conflict. Modifications of the T-72 AM Monkey were the Assad Babil and Saddam, however were downgraded versions of the already downgraded Monkey. These were used in the Gulf War of 1991, however the reputation of the T-72 was severely damaged by the use of T-72s in this conflict. The most famous tank battle of the Gulf War was probably the Battle for 73 Easting, where American M1a1 Abrams and Bradley IFVs decimated the feared Iraqi Republican Guard with a single loss of a Bradley IFV. This was all carried out during a sandstorm. Many were also knocked out at long range by long-range ATGMs and shots fired by British Challenger 1s and Hellfires fired by AH-64A Apaches. This year, the recent conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, T-72s have both been used by Azerbaijan and Armenia alongside BMP-2 IFVs. They have suffered heavy casualties to ATGMs and more, but most notably drones. This tank here is probably one of the most well-known and most renowned tanks of its time, and even today it's still Britain's main MBT. The Challenger 2 remains as one of Britain's finest tanks produced during the late 20th and early 21st century. As the Cold War showed some increasing tension and rivalry between East and West, the tanks of all major armies needed to be up to date and ready to go into immediate action. At the end of the Second World War, the British had produced the Centurion Mark I, which was a starting point of an extremely successful tank series. The Centurions were gradually upgraded, however in the early 60s were deemed to be obsolete. New tanks were eventually put forward, such as the Vickers MBT and Chieftain. The next tank that Britain would use to defend itself from a Soviet attack was the Chieftain. It was a well-armoured tank featuring a turret with many curves, and showed some resemblance to the Challenger 1, which was going to come later. The Chieftain was a kind of mix between the Challenger 1 and Centurion. However, a large part of the tank was a focus on armour. The British had not followed West Germany's idea into making tanks such as the Leopard A1 and other fast and mobile, yet lightly armoured tanks. The Centurions and Chieftains were not the fastest of tanks, both having around 40 km an hour of top speed. The Challenger 1 was almost an accident, having been designed under the guidelines of export versions of the Chieftain. In the late 70s, Iran ordered some Chieftains and were actually quite happy with it. However, there was still one issue: the speed. The top speed of the Chieftain was only 40 km an hour on road. This then became the main driving factor of the improved Chieftain. Several different modifications were made to the Chieftain Mark V, which included 3 different prototypes, also known as the FV4030-1 and FV4030-2, Sheer or Lion. The Sheer 1 was ordered by Jordan and had an improved running gear which was proved to be similar to the Challenger 1. The Sheer 1 was further modified and turned into the Sheer 2. However, the Sheer 2 was cancelled after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which overthrew the Pahlavi dynasty, and in turn the Shah was exiled. The tank was then further modified by the Royal Ordnance Factory's ROF, and then was christened the Cheviot, and then rechristened as the Challenger 1, and then was accepted into service, and production started in 1983 and finished in late 89. The Challenger 1 needed a replacement, and that came in the form of the Challenger 2. Although the Chally 1 and 2 look quite aesthetically similar, however they are quite different. According to Vickers in their promotional video, they say that only 3% of the parts were all the same. This all started when Vickers Defence Systems, now BAE Systems Land and Armaments, when in 1986 they privately tried to create a tank to replace the Challenger 1. Vickers then completed the designs of the tank and were sent to the MOD, which is the Ministry of Defence. In 1989, £90 million was given to Vickers for a demonstrator, which was then stated by the Secretary of Defence, George Younger, and this offer was presented in the House of Commons. In total, 3 different specifications were made, and with 11 different criteria, and then it was finally put to test against the American M1 Abrams and German Leopard 2 in 1991. The MOD then placed an order for 127 MBTs and 13 driver training vehicles costing a whopping £520 million, and then a further order of 259 MBTs, with 9 more driver training vehicles for another £800 million. There was also an additional order by Oman, and with all the tanks added up, comes to a grand total of 446 by the end of 1994. Most tests were carried out for the ISRD, In-Service Reliability Demonstration, in Bovington and Lulworth. More tests were carried out for the ISRD, In-Service Reliability Demonstration, in Bovington and Lulworth. It entered service in 1998 with the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment in Germany. The front of the hull was fitted with a large flat plate which was not curved and was very large. In fact, it was a massive weak spot. There was some armour there, but not enough to stop a TOW ATGM or an APFS-DS round. This issue was made clear when an incident in 2006 in Iraq, where a tandem-shaped RPG-29 projectile penetrated the lower front plate, so the hull needed to be upgraded. However, this took time. Only until 2016 was this modification introduced, with Dorchester composite armour blocks were added for increased protection. A downside to the extensive modifications Challenger 2 has undergone is that the ERA or explosive reactive armour and Dorchester additional plates are all costing to one thing: speed. With all of its armour being added, it's likely that the tank will become very heavy and slow, with a similar problem that the Centurion and Chieftains face. The Challenger 2F is almost 62.5 tons. That's just under the weight of a King Tiger. Downside to the extensive modifications Challenger 2 has undergone is that the ERA or explosive reactive armour and Dorchester additional plates are all costing to one thing: speed. With all of its armour being added, it's likely that the tank will become very heavy and slow, with a similar problem that the Centurion and Chieftains face. The Challenger 2F is almost 62.5 tons. That's just under the weight of a King Tiger. Another problem with the Challenger 2 is that it uses 2-piece ammunition. This means that the charges and projectiles are stored separately and not as one-piece ammunition. The projectiles, mainly HESH and APFSDS, are stored in the turret. HESH rounds are also a form of plastic explosive. It minimizes an explosion during an ammunition mess-up. The lack of blow-up panels, like those on the Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams, do not pose a big problem, as the dangerous charges are placed in protective bins in the hull of the tank. Another problem is that the APFSDS rounds are much shorter than their Western counterparts. The ammunition length in a Challenger 2 is around 60 cm long. However, tanks such as Leopard 2 have around 1 meter long one-piece ammunition. The lack of storage space and the length of the breech in the Challenger 2 is probably the main reason why penetrator heads of the APFSDS rounds are so short compared to M1 and Leopard 2. Another downside, which has varied debate, is whether the rifled gun is better than a smoothbore gun of the same size. The barrel of a smoothbore gun is much less prone to damage than a rifled barrel, as the small grooves that make the projectile spin are much less prone to damage. However, despite the problems Challenger 2 faces in this modern era, it is still one of the greatest tanks produced, as proven in March 2003 invasion of Iraq. The 7th Armoured Brigade, part of the 1st Armoured Division, was in action around Basura with 120 Challenger 2s, providing additional support for British forces as well as dealing with a small tank threat. Some Iraqi T-54-55s. These T-55s were no match for the Challenger 2's L-30A1 120mm rifled gun firing APFSDS. Sub-problems that had come up 18 months earlier during the second Saif Saria exercise indicated that the Challenger 2 needed to protect its filters and engine from sand and dust. This was similar to the problem the early Spitfires faced in North Africa, as they had no tropical filter for the engine. The need for an upgrade was needed, which would be the CLIP program, Challenger Lethality Improvement Program. The use of two-part ammunition was considered a replacement, and the current L-30A1 rifle gun was replaced with a 120mm Rheinmetall L-55 gun, which was the same used on the Leopard 2A6. Using this new gun and ammunition would mean it would have the same standard ammunition used by NATO, which includes tungsten-based kinetic energy penetrators, which do not have a political or environmental issues about their use, unlike the use of depleted uranium rounds. The production of rifled 120mm ammunition has been closed in the UK for some years, so there is a limit on remaining shells for the L-30A1 gun. In January of 2006 there was a Challenger 2 fitted with a German L-55 gun and underwent trials. The smoothbore L-55 is the same length of a rifled L-30A1 and was fitted with the existing bore excavator, thermal sleeve and muzzle reference system. The single-piece ammunition of the L-55 would mean the existing ammunition storage configuration would have to be changed in order to inhibit the new one-piece rounds. In 2006, a figure of 386 million was estimated for the cost of all British Challenger 2s to be fitted with the German L-55 gun. Some Challenger 2s also have an additional L7A1 GPMG, General Purpose Machine Gun, and also additional MBC production systems. However, this upgrade was nearly abandoned as the defense budget was reduced in mid-2008. The LEP program, Challenger 2 Life Extension Program, was designed to increase the service length from an established 2025 to 2035. This program originated from July 2013 and reached its initial stage in 2014. However, it is decided that not all of the Challenger 2s would be fitted with the new LEP program, and that the L-55 smoothbore gun had been dropped. In October of 2018, a new demonstrator, which was the Black Knight, featured LEP modifications, with modifications for the fire control, commander sights and more. There was also regenerated braking, which could allow for stowage of some power and increase space in the turret for turret rotation speed. Several variants have been made of the Challenger 2, which include various roles such as armoured recovery tanks or bridge layers. The Titan bridge layer is based upon the chassis of an original Challenger 2, but is fitted with a Chieftain Armoured Vehicle Launch Bridge (CHAVLB), which can carry a single 26-metre long bridge, or two 12-metre long bridges. The Titan could also be fitted with an additional dozer blade and entered service in 2006. Another modification is the Trojan. This is fitted with a large crane and can have a mounting for a claw to pick up heavy objects, and also can be fitted with a much larger dozer blade. The AVRI, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, can also carry fascines. The export model of the Challenger 2 is the Challenger 2E. It is equipped with a new integrated weapons control system, which includes a gyro-stabilized panoramic Sagem MVS 580 day/night sight for the commander and a Sagem Savan 15 gyro-stabilized sight for the gunner. The power pack has also been replaced with a new 1500 horsepower Euro power pack with a transverse mounted MTU MT883 diesel engine, which is further connected to the Renec HSWL 295TM automatic transmission. This is the same power pack used on the French Charles Leclerc, which was also delivered to the UAE. There is also a standardized air cooling system optimized for use in the desert. The camouflage used on this tank is called the Berlin Brigade Camouflage. It all started when the British Chieftain tanks operating in urban areas in West Germany when their camouflage was inadequate. New camouflage was tested and actually blended in quite well with the surroundings. The distributive camouflage idea was taken from World War II ships, when radar detection had not been massively used and finding targets by sight was the only option. This new camouflage was used on the Challenger 2 in the August of 2017 and went into the service with the Ajax squadron, based in Salisbury Plain. The Challenger 2's main competitors in a similar role include the American M1a2 Sep Abrams, Leopard A1a1, Indian Argent tank, Ukrainian T-84 and Japanese Type 10, and many more competitors of its era. The Challenger remains as one of the greatest tanks of all times, and probably will be for the next decade. In 1966, the Bundeswehr was wanting to replace the obsolete M42 Duster. They needed a new, fully enclosed tank to serve as its replacement. The vehicle was soon to become the Flügelabwehrkanone Gepard. The Gepard was developed by Oerlikon, Krauss-Maffei and other manufacturers, which formed one of the best anti-aircraft defenders until the rise of surface-to-air missiles. The rise of aircraft in the First World War opened new gates for a new form of combat. This also meant that the enemy wanted to shoot down the planes, thus anti-aircraft was probably in its most basic form. Soon, trucks were seen with anti-aircraft guns of all lengths and calibers on the back, and this also spread across the interwar period. German cargo trucks such as the Sonderkampfwagen 10-4 and 6-2 had 20mm and 37mm guns. Guns such as the Flak 41 proved effective in bringing down aircraft. Tanks such as the Verschlagwagen or VFW were vehicles with large guns fitted on pre-existing tank cars. The Flak 41 would be used by Rommel to defeat heavy B-1 Bisses of the French army during the invasion of France, and then became an effective anti-tank weapon. Similar guns were used on tanks such as the Tiger 1 and 2. This is a story for another time. The Tiger 1 will hopefully come later this year, however I'm drifting away from the topic of this video. More and more vehicles are being used to defend against the air. Surplus tank hulls were now beginning to be used as mountings for turreted anti-aircraft guns. There was even a Gepard which came before the West German one. It was the Flakpanzer 38T Gepard. Like its distant modern relative, it shares something similar. It has a hull of a pre-existing tank. The Flakpanzer 38T came from the Czech-designed Panzer 38T, and the Gepard came from the Leopard 1. Back to the development of the SBAA. Around halfway through the war, the Germans created the Wirbelwind. It was a turreted tank on a Panzer IV chassis and mounted 4 20mm guns. The turret was not fully enclosed, which exposed the crew. A few other Flak Panzers were produced and proposed, which included the Flak Panzer 341 Coelian. It was a fully enclosed SBAA which had twin 37mm guns. I made a video on this around a month back, so please feel free to check it out. The Second World War had come to an end, but tensions were rising between the US and Soviet Russia. The Cold War was starting. The jet age meant that jets could travel twice and if not triple the amount of speed a World War II fighter could fly at, so guns was considered to be obsolete. The Americans stopped development for SBAAs in the late 50s, with further emphasized on the M42 Duster. The Duster was used in Vietnam but used in a ground support role instead of its intended use to be countering the Vietnamese Air Force. The Russians also developed a similar SBA, the ZSU-57, which featured twin 57mm guns which could fire at a reasonable rate. These two SBAs had low-velocity, slow-firing guns, which were highly unlikely to stop an aircraft going Mach 1 or above. Surface-to-air missiles were seen as the next step up, and therefore these two SBAs did not single-handedly protect the skies from the enemy. The Bundeswehr wanted to get rid of their aging M42 Dusters, so they looked for replacements. Two projects were investigated. The first was the Matador, designed by Krauss-Maffei, Rheinmetall, AEG and Siemens. The other prototype was designed by Oerlikon, Porsche and a few other manufacturers. These prototypes were the Matador and 5PFZA, in which the 5PFZA was chosen as the best vehicle. A test batch was ordered and named the B1, which were delivered in 1973 under the designation of 5PFZ V2. By September of 73 it was designated the Flugabwehrkanone Panzer Gepard. In English, Gepard means cheetah. The first order was placed of 420 vehicles. After the first 195 tanks were completed, the Siemens laser rangefinder was mounted on the vehicle. The Gepard has seen service since the 70s and only has just been retired by the Bundeswehr in around 2010. You may think that the hull of the tank is similar to one of my previous builds, the Leopard A1a1, which came out last week. Both tanks use the same hull. The Leopard 1 hull is almost untouched in order to complete this process. It was fitted with an extra 6 24-volt batteries, and the distance between the third and fourth road wheel was also a tad bit wider. The engine under the engine deck was the same 830 horsepower MU-MB-CA M500 diesel engine. However, in addition, there was another engine with an original Leopard 1's MREC would have been. It was a Daimler-Benz OM314 4-cylinder diesel engine to supply the power of the radar, turret traverse and other electrical systems. The exhaust from this engine is on the left-hand side of the hull. The Gepard has only 3 crew members, a commander, driver and gunner. The gunner and commander both have stabilised panoramic sights, which are integrated into the turret roof. Both gunner and commander share a large hatch in order to escape the vehicle. The large turret is a big change to the Leopard 1's original turrets. When it came out in the 70s, the equipment was extremely advanced, and one of the most dangerous anti-aircraft platforms ever produced. The Gepard's armament was unforgiving. Twin 35mm Oerlikon KDA cannons, which were 90 calibers in length. These could fire a total of 1,100 rounds a minute. The guns could be elevated to an almost 90-degree state and could depress 10 degrees. It could fire a variety of rounds such as semi-armor piercing high-explosive incendiary rounds to frangible armor-piercing discarding saber rounds. The cannons work in unison with the radar system and rangefinder. The Gepard started off by using Doppler radars. The Doppler effect is used to calculate the velocity and distance of a selected target. An MPDR-12 Doppler surveillance radar is mounted on the rear of the turret and has a range of 15 kilometers. The radar searches for targets within 15-kilometer radius. When an aircraft is identified as hostile, the radar can track its speed, distance, elevation and range. Over the years, the Gepard has been gradually upgraded. The Doppler radar system has been replaced with an S-band radar. S-band is part of the microwave band in the electromagnetic spectrum, in which frequencies from 2 to 4 GHz, which is similar to what NASA uses, as well as Bluetooth and Wi-Fi devices. Also, in combat, Gepards would be deployed with Stinger SAM teams, which could take advantage of the Gepard's radar. This is not really used anymore as the Gepard's success of the Ocelot light flak vehicle, which was based on the Weasel IFV, can still do the same job with ATGMs and SAMs. Just like the Leopard 1, the Gepard has many different operators. These operators include Dutch, Jordanian, Brazilian and many more. Competitors of the Gepard's class are quite interesting, such as the American M257 Sergeant York of the M163 Vulcan, Type 87, Chieftain Marksman and Soviet ZSU-23. These are all SBAAs from the Cold War which have guns and radar but no SAMs. In 1992, the French army put a new tank into service. This tank would become the successor of the aging AMX-30. The Char Leclerc is probably one of the fastest and lightest of the Western MBTs. It features a powerful gun and puts mobility over armour. The Leclerc is still the primary MBT of the French army, and is probably one of the top 5 best tanks within NATO. At the end of the Second World War, France had been hit hard. It had endured over 4 years of occupation by Nazi Germany, and her military was almost completely wiped out. Other than a few resistance groups, such as the French Resistance, they had no official army. French tank production during the early stages of the war was nearly completely overrun by superior German tanks. Other than a few captured Panthers and Tigers that the French used in the post-war years, the French had no domestically made tanks. At the end of the Second World War, only one design made it to a nearly complete stage. That was the ARL-44. However, that project was abandoned and only a handful were made. There were a few light tanks made such as the AMX-13 series, however no medium tank or MBT.
Le chargeur est sonné.
Some designs such as the AMX-50 series was put forward. These tanks look really nice, especially with the AMX-50's 120mm gun and AMX M4. I might also consider making some in the future, as it seems like they've got a good amount of history behind them, and there is also an interesting concept of oscillating turrets, as seen on the AMX-13. Anyway, back to the story. The AMX-50 program in short was abandoned due to economic and political situations, and the American-built M47 Pattern 2s were put into place instead. Next, we move on to the AMX-30, France's version of the Leopard 1. All had been going well for post-war Germany and France, and were both getting along quite nicely, setting apart their differences in the past. In 1956, there were concerns about the M47 becoming outdated for both the French army and Bundeswehr. A new tank was needed. This tank was intended to be supplied to the majority of countries in Europe and NATO. The Finbel military staff organisation consisted of Italy, Netherlands, Luxembourg and Belgium. It was later extended to Finabel with the introduction of Germany and France to the programme. It was named the Europanzer and tested at St. Louis on the Franco-German Military Institute. The original concept for the Finabel 3A5 requirements in 1957 asked for a 30-ton tank with a 105mm main gun. In 1958, the accession of de Gaulle to power made the purpose of the Finabel 3A5 made with nuclear capabilities. This ended up excluding Germany and Italy in order to prevent hostility from the US and UK. In the end, the Germans went for the rifled L7 105mm gun, which was also licensed by Britain instead of the French-made 105mm gun. Italy as well as Germany left the project, and that ended the project. The French would further develop this concept into various prototypes which eventually turned into the AMX-30 series. The AMX-30 featured torsion bar suspension as well as good armour and mobility, and showed some areas in which it could easily be improved. However, the AMX-30B was in need of serious upgrades, such as the new transmission which was developed in 1938. The next tank was the AMX-32. It was designed as an improved variant of the AMX-30. The turret was completely reshaped after being completely welded. It also featured a new panoramic sight for the commander as well as 8 periscopes on the cupola. Although this seemed like a pretty good tank for the foreign countries to use, there would be no orders at Eurosatory. The next development stage of the AMX-30 was the AMX-40. It was designed for both export markets and for the French army itself. The prototype was partially based on the AMX-30 V2 and was presented at Eurosatory in 1983. In the next 2 years, 2 more prototypes were made and were designated the AMX-40 E4. The armour was better than the AMX-30's, featuring a perforated and laminated steel. It could protect itself from heat and saber rounds. However, its protection was extremely weak for the 90s. The first initial thoughts of replacing the AMX-30 came as early as 1971. The Engine Principal Prospective program indicated that new Soviet MBTs were still much better than the AMX-30. Some new specifications to the next design were published in 1977, and once again the French turned to West Germany. West Germany was already working on a program to supersede the Leopard 1. The program was the Kampfpanzer III. The French called their own design the Napoleon I. This was signed 3 years later in 1980 for the joint development. However, there were some disagreements, which eventually rose to both nations deciding to venture out into their own domestic designs. Also, a new program with the USA also failed. The AMX-48 or EPC program, Engine Principal de Combat, was a French plan in order to create a new MBT. Other options were considered, such as a license-built Leopard 2 or a M1 Abrams. Even thoughts of a license-built Merkava were even put forward. However, this was rejected by the French army as they wanted to have an active form of protection instead of a passive projection. The MX-32 and 40 both helped the concept of less armour but excellent mobility. This new tank needed to have almost double the armour of its predecessors. This resulted in the need for 400mm of RHA equivalency, particularly for kinetic energy penetrators. This could only be achieved with a tank weighing over 50 tons. When the project was well underway in 1985, thoughts of a partnership with another army to reduce the overall unit cost were considered. With extremely good relations with the UAE, were also operated the AMX-30. They helped secure another batch of 400 vehicles. The name given to the Shah Leclerc is in memory of General Philippe Leclerc de Haute-Cloque, who led French forces in North Africa and in Italy, and also helped liberate Paris in 1944. The development of computers meant that designs could be done digitally, however drawing boards were still used. The project took 6 years to develop, and the first 6 prototypes were delivered by GIAT. The first batch of 4 tanks were sent to foreign countries to undergo comparative trials. There was later a batch of 17 tanks, which included many modifications to the turret and hull armour. The series was modified in total of 3 times and was evolved from 1998 to 2008. The Leclerc is much more compact than the previous AMX-30, although it still weighs around 54.5 tons compared to the 43.7 tons of the AMX-30. The smoke discharges are integrated to the rear of the turret, which is quite a unique feature. It was further modified in the late 2000s, and the armour consists of modular blocks with composite armour which could be replaced quickly in need of upgrades. Chauban armour was also considered, however rejected as it is too optimised to defeat hollow charge weapons, whereas French systems are less specialised to counter both sabre and hollow charge rounds. The Azure Urban Kit comes with additional side skirts consisting of composite materials, as well as bar armour on the hull. Also, a special modification was made to the engine deck which reduced the chances of damage inflicted on the engine in event of a handheld Molotov cocktail or petrol bomb hitting and damaging the engine. This was primarily used by the UAE in 2011, however the French army also tested it. There has also been a few AEVs made from the Leclerc chassis, such as the Leclerc EPG, which is an excavator arm which can be fitted with a clamp, shovel or other modifications. An additional mine clearing kit has also been installed. A concept for converting some early Leclerc hulls into heavy reconnaissance vehicles in a similar style to the BMP T-1. Some of the features included a vast array of armaments which ranged from 280 GMs and a 40mm gun to an entirely brand new turret. However, this design never made it into service. One very big issue with the Leclerc is that there are very few export variants. This is because it's very expensive. Only few nations, such as the United Arab Emirates, could afford to purchase this MBT. The wealthy UAE is one of the only countries to be able to afford a number of Leclercs. One Leclerc costs around 6.5 million euros compared to the 5 million for a Leopard 2A6 or 4 million for a Challenger 2. Only today that the South Korean and Japanese Type 10 exceed this price, which might be a sign of growing military strength in East Asia. Also, the euro devaluating might also increase prices for both the K2 and Type 10, both being around 8 million euros respectively. Although the German tank industry worked under an extremely wrong leadership, they created some of the most technologically advanced tanks, mirroring the earlier MBTs to come in the Cold War. Tanks such as the Panther showed a good medium tank or MBT needed to be fast and have decent protection, as well as being able to pack quite a punch. The German Leopard 1 greatly showed a proper rival to the tanks of the Soviet Union, and also became a symbol of the recovery of West Germany. As the Second World War raged on, the Germans produced bigger and greater tanks. Probably the most notable was the Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther. It was a well-protected tank, offering heavily sloped sides inspired by the Soviet T-34. It also yielded a powerful 75mm Pak-42, which allowed for an extremely good gun at long range. The mobility was also excellent. So why do I keep on blabbing about the Panther? Well, it greatly showed the key characteristics of a modern MBT: good mobility, not heaps of armour, and above all an extremely good high-velocity main gun. This is all of the things that are needed in a modern main battle tank. The need for a lumbering heavy tank is no longer needed. The early traces of the Leopard 1 go back to the 50s. Germany had been divided between East and West. East was controlled by USSR and part of the Warsaw Pact, and the East was part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. West Germany thrived in the post-war years compared to the suffering of East Germany. West Germany was given the permission to make a new army to defend against a potential USSR threat. Also, at the time, the Franco-German relationship was probably at its highest point, so both countries decided to embark on creating a new MBT suitable for both French army and Bundeswehr. For the French, they needed a tank which could be pressed into service. However, they had only just cancelled the AMX-50 program. I have a video on this which is in the perspective of the French, so if you are interested then head on over to the Leclerc video, link in the description. Back to the development of the Leopard 1. The West Germans were gifted the M47 and M48 to act as a stopgap, however needed replacements. The name of the replacement tank was originally called the Standard Panzer. It was later renamed to the Europanzer with the introduction of several more nations. Therefore, the Europanzer project was formed. The project featured a number of countries such as Germany, France and Italy. The guidelines of the vehicle were relatively simple. It had to weigh 30 tons and it had a power ratio of above 30, and armour which could withstand a 20mm autocannon. Also, because hollow charge rounds and heat FS were available, the thought of putting heaps of armour on the tank was not a requirement. Instead, mobility and firepower were the main driving factors of this new tank. In '58, it was decided that the Phase 2 prototypes would be made. 3 different prototypes were formed, which were in Group A, B and C. In Group A, there was Porsche, which created their Model 734. Next, there was Group B, which eventually came up with the RU251 prototype. Set B was made up of Rheinmetall, Bergmann, Hanomag and a few more. Set C was quickly forced to drop out as they did not have a prototype to put forward. This pretty much left Group A and B. The Bundeswehr purchased 50 pre-series tanks from Group A, and in 1963 the government made it clear that the Porsche prototype in Group A was going to be put into service. Also, around a similar time to that, the French were still working with the Germans, before venturing out and making the AMX-30 instead. The Porsche prototype, known as the Zero Series, featured a cast turret as well as a raised engine deck to allow for easier maintenance, as well as a new place for the radiators. A better optic system was fitted, which also allowed for a new rangefinder. Construction of the pre-series began with Krauss-Maffei complex in Munich. The Leopard 1 does not have the thickest of armour, but doesn't need to. The hull's front has only 70mm in the front plate and 35 in the sides, with an extremely thin rear of only 25mm. But armour is not needed, as I mentioned earlier. Lessons were taken from World War II, such as the engine components being in the same place. Tanks such as the Panther and Tiger had engines in the back, but transmission and final drive in the front, so by putting all of the components for the drive in one place, allowed for easier maintenance. It is said that the entire engine of a Leopard 1 can be taken out in under half an hour, which is quite impressive. The suspension used is torsion bar and can give an extremely smooth drive even on rough terrain. There were several main variants of the Leopard 1. The Leopard A1a1 featured a British-made L7A3 gun which could fire HESH, Heat FS and other rounds. It also had new rubber side skirts, which allowed for a cheaper protection against rounds such as Heat FS, as well as keeping the mud and dust down when quickly changing positions on the battlefield. By 1974 there was a newly modelled thermal sleeve for the 1A1A1. The next step was the Leopard 1A2, which production started in 1972 and ended in '74. 232 tanks were made, and this modification included the 1A1A1's modifications to be standardised, as well as a heavier turret. Next is the tank that you see in front of you. It is the Leopard 1A3. The 1A3 had a new turret which consisted of 2 steel plates for each panel. The turret was much less cramped and also showed some resemblance to the Krauss-Maffei Leopard 2K prototype. The cupola was also improved for the commander. The 1A3 was also exported to the Canadians, which was then called the Leopard C1. Further modifications were added and this became the Leopard C2. There were also some additional armour packages on both Canadian Leopard 1s, which became the Leopard C1 and 2 Mexas. The next step was the Leopard 1A5. The 1A1 and 1A2 were used for this upgrade. The 1A5 featured a new night vision equipment, as well as new plates and optical sights. There was also a short-lived 1A6 which wasn't really used as the Leopard 2 introduced into service. There were several different modifications added to the Leopard 1 hull, such as the Flakpanzer Gepard, Biber bridge layer and many more. The Gepard was a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun or SPAAG. It featured a radar and twin 35mm Oerlikon cannons. The bridge layer Biber or Beaver was an impressive bridge layer which incorporated an interesting scissor mechanism in order to lay down the bridge. There was also an interesting Bergpanzer II, which was an armoured recovery vehicle. The British Army also used a few Leopard 1s in service, which are used for training purposes. When the Leopard 1 was exported to other countries, the tank needed to meet their specific needs, so they were modified by each country. Many countries bought the Leopard 1, such as Greece, Belgium, Dutch, Brazil, Australia and Danish, and many more recipients of the Leopard 1. The Leopard 1 remains as one of the most well-known and distinctive tanks of the Cold War, and is a symbol of Germany's recovery from the Second World War. Thank you very much for watching. If you would like to support me, then please consider subscribing and sharing my content. The next video will be on a vehicle with the same hull as this one but plays a different role. It was the first ever tank to be produced by the Russian Federation. It was going to raise the standards for the Russian MBTs. It was designed to replace the aging T-72 and counter the latest generation of Western MBTs. It was the T-90. Firstly, we need to take a step back and briefly look at two different tanks to get an idea of where the T-90 was originally coming from. Those two tanks were the T-72 and T-80. These are both Soviet-era tanks, being characteristic of Soviet tank doctrine and design. Low silhouette, powerful gun, not the best crew comfort, but overall a good offensive and defensive tank. By the 80s, the T-72B was the most prominent main battle tank in the Soviet infantry, yielding a fierce 125mm smoothbore gun and Contact 1 ERA. Later models that appeared in the early 2000s and 2010s, such as the T-72B3, are more modernised T-72s made to T-90 standards. In some instances, the T-72B3s have better protection than early T-90s. If you would like to hear more about the T-72, I have a video a few weeks back, which covers the entire history on making the Soviet icon. Feel free to check this out at the end of this video. On to the T-80U, which was the second factor that helped inspire the later T-90, appearing in 1985 and fully kitted out with Contact 5 ERA, as well as other modifications, including the first Soviet use of a gas turbine engine. Now, let's move on to the development of the T-90. In 1992, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that they could not afford to manufacture two MBTs in parallel service. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviets had two tanks in simultaneous production. Firstly, the most up-to-date variation or model, whilst the inferior predecessor that was easier to produce was kept in service, tandem to the modern, more expensive tank. However, due to these cuts, they still had to carry on production of the T-80U and T-72B to keep both the local economy and manufacturers from collapsing. Even though the Omsk plant made 5 T-80s and Nizhny Tagil made 15 T-72s, they still expected to fulfill the orders made. The T-72 was given a sophisticated fire control system, which was implemented into a new model designated as the T-72BU. After modifications received in 1990, this was referred to as the T-90 program, further modified by the Kutsev-Vendiktov Design Bureau. It was to be primarily produced at the Nizhny Tagil plant, and with some other components made at Omsk. The final prototype, which was later turned into a production model and revealed in 1992, was a T-88, which was placed into production in 1993. Upgraded Contact 5 ERA was placed on turret cheeks and hull, and aesthetically resembled a T-72. Despite this correlation, there were many differences. Many of the original components seen on the T-72 were modified or overhauled completely, and the base production variant of the T-90 came out in 1994, and could possibly have been viewed as an extremely modified T-72. As per usual, the export market was taken into consideration, and the T-90S was made for the market, with the usual downsides for export models. The T-90 also had 3-tiered protection system, where composite armour of the turret, Contact 5 ERA and Shtora 1 countermeasure systems, which detonated smoke grenades and other things, helped to drastically modernise and improve crew and tank survivability. This is probably one of the key defining qualities of the T-90 that separates it from the older T-72s and cements its place as a third generation MBT. Although production ceased in 2015, being replaced by the T-14 Armata, there have been 2,260 T-90s made, with the lowest production number for any Soviet or Russian MBT. Each unit cost an average of $2.5 million. The first production variants of the T-90 were coupled to an almost identical engine to the T-72 BU, which was the V12 V84 MS diesel, giving out 840 horsepower. It was connected to an APU, which also assisted in several subsystems internally on the T-90, which was beneficial as it could operate these systems without starting the main engine. The engine could thrust 46 tons of Russian MBT to 60 km on-road or 45 km off-road. The transmission was manually operated with 7 forward and 1 reverse gear. The power was given to the sprockets in a similar fashion to the T-72B and was assisted with 6 road wheels either side, spreading the weight and being suspended using torsion bars. Range of this MBT was around 550 kilometers, which was pretty decent compared to the fuel-thirsty gas turbines. For underwater travel, the T-90 could submerge up to 1.2 meters without preparation and 5 meters with. It could ford most shallow rivers without the need for bridges. A snorkel could be added, or OPVT. The T-90 could climb to a maximum of 30 degrees of terrain and could stay stable at that angle. It could cross a trench 2.8 meters wide and could climb obstacles 0.85 meters high. Alongside smoke discharges in the turret, there was a smoke generator which used the fumes of the engine to create smoke. Most T-90s used a T-72 hull, which was made of steel rolled homogeneous armour, at around 50 to 150 mm in strength. Next in protection for the turret was the cheeks, which were integrated with what was nicknamed as Dolly Parton. This was extremely successful in tests in the early 90s, however this couldn't sufficiently stop modern APFSDS, so Contact 5 ERA was added throughout the tank. Protection levels with ERA range from 800 to 830mm against APFSDS, and against HEAT-FS was around 1150 to 1350. The T-90 was given Shtora 1 electro-optical jammer, which jams the semi-automatic command to line sight, SACLOS or ATGMs, laser rangefinders and target designators. Shtora is most effective with hard-to-kill systems such as the Arena. Shtora is used by the T-80U/UK and T-84. They are the red eyes of the T-90. The T-90 had a 125mm 2A46 M2 main gun, later modified to the 2A46 M5. These were both smoothbore types of barrel. The latter was assisted by the 2E46-4 two-plane electromechanical stabilizer. 43 rounds of ammunition could be stored in the carousel below the turret, which was connected to the autoloader. The autoloader is efficiently the same model as seen on the T-72B and can select APFSDS, heat, HE frag rounds very quickly and efficiently. The commander has the ability to pass the target coordinates to the gunner or ballistic computer whilst he is looking for the next target. The fry control system increases the chance of the T-90 to get the first shot off in an engagement, which doesn't guarantee, but gives a higher chance of being the victor of an engagement. The second heavy machine gun is mounted on the roof, and is remotely controlled, which is an added bonus. The T-90 was originally named the T-72BU, until it was changed to the T-90A. This first version was complemented with the arrival of the command version, the T-90K, equipped with the usual radio and other modifications to the command variant. The T-90E was the first export version in export style, with downgraded quantities, but no orders were placed. The first appearance of the T-90A was in 1999. It had a fully welded turret, derived from the Object 187 experimental MBT, breaking the long consistency of cast turret design. The T-90S was the first effective export version, which received a 1000 horsepower, 750 kilowatt engine, without Shtora 1 APS. There were also 2 different turret armor versions, and in Acrylic are shown as the T-90C. There was also a commanded version of the T-90S, the T-90SK. India also modified their T-90Ss to the T-90S Bhishma. The T-90A is the latest modification, which was introduced in the 2010s. It had a completely new turret with the new firing control system, Kalina, which was achieved using the new ballistic computer and integrated combat information and control systems, with additional digital displays to enhance the awareness in the battlefield. A new autoloader was present, as well as an upgraded 2A46 M5 smoothbore gun. The T-90 has a secondary gun which is dedicated in delivering rapid fire, completely remotely controlled, to counter low-flying helicopters and aircraft. This is of 20mm caliber. The turret also has an assortment of digital cameras for enhanced surveillance and vision, specifically for the use of urban combat. The T-90 is an export version of the T-90 with an assortment of new ERA and other internal modifications. In 1995, the Russian Defense Ministry prioritized the T-90 over the T-80, in which the T-90 was preferred, as although it was inferior to the T-80 in mobility, the T-90 had cheaper running costs, less complex mechanism, and a more fuel-efficient diesel compared to the thirsty gas turbine of the T-80. The T-80BV also performed poorly in the First Chechen War in urban combat stages. In September of 1995, 107 T-90s have been produced and have been stationed at the Siberian and Far Eastern military districts. The 1999 version of the T-90A, Vladimir, with the fully welded turret, entered service. It saw combat in the 1999 Chechen invasion of Dagestan. According to Army reports, the T-90 survived 7 RPG hits. The success of the Arena and Shatora protection systems have been displayed in these conflicts. The T-95 program was also announced, however the Russians resorted into modifying the T-90 and putting the T-14 into production. Very few T-90AMs were built, and due to the cost of the T-14 being much too high for the export market, the T-90MS will probably fill the role of the next primary export Russian MBT for the near future. This here is a LEGO version of the American M1a2 Sep V2 Abrams. It's taken roughly 2 months to complete with on and off progress. This has probably been my most detailed tank to date, fitted with the Bose control system. It is capable of a whopping 2.8 km an hour on even terrain, and 2 km an hour off-road. Now for a bit of history behind this tank. The M1 Abrams first entered production in 1978, armed with the 105mm M68A1 gun, which was a license-built version of the wonderful Royal Ordnance L7 105mm gun, found on many Western tanks of that period, and developed by the British. This gun, however, by the 80s was very outdated, along with quite a few outdated systems on the tank. For instance, the lack of commander thermals and the gunner only having Gen 1 thermals was only the tip of the iceberg. If I were to list every issue, we would be here all day. Let's not do that and move on. Okay, right. So basically, the Yanks decided to add some flavour to their Abrams by adding the M256 gun, which also happened to be a licence-built gun, this time not from us, but from the Germans. This was a licence-built Rheinmetall L44 120mm smoothbore gun. At this time we can introduce the M829 rounds, specifically designed for the M256 gun. This upgrade was called the M1a1, which was introduced in 1985. This was closely followed by the M1a2 in 1986, with further upgrades such as the long-awaited Commander's Independent Thermal Viewer, or CITV. Being upgraded once again and introduced in 1999, the M1a2 Sep also featured depleted uranium, which was also seen on some previous models of the Abrams. The depleted uranium armour is found in the turret cheeks. The M1a2 Sep V2 is the second of 3 modifications for the Sep Abrams, along with the V1 and V3. The V2 has Crow's remote control weapon system, which is the gun on the left side of the turret. Now back to the LEGO. The M1 can complete a full turret rotation in just under 4 seconds, which is quite unrealistic, but can be adjusted to the same turret rotation speed of a real M1. Here you can see the off-road capabilities, although driving it through mud does have a slight problem. When it dries, it prevents the track from moving smoothly, which makes the track come off more often. I couldn't use any torsion bars, so I resorted to using 2 road wheel bogies, although the third road wheel along is just on a pivot arm, so in some shots the road wheel is not properly sitting on the track. Each track is individually powered by a single XL motor, producing around 40 newtons per centimetre of torque. I've opted for the wider track links, which evenly spreads the weight of the tank over a larger surface, and is also why the Abrams didn't sink into the snow. The turret functions are powered by 3 motors, 2L and 1M motor to do the horizontal and vertical drive, as well as fire the small spring-loaded gun. This is an option, as you can see it in action here. However, it hasn't been seen in the outside shots as I replaced it with a coaxial machine gun, not the spring-loaded gun. You can see my usual brick-built figures on top of the tank, commander and loader. On the back of the Abrams I could go wild with the stowage. These American tanks are often covered in stowage. For example, my M48 and Shermans both had a decent amount of stowage on them. As you can see on the M1, there are water bottles, soda boxes and some other boxes. The camouflage on the Abrams is a three-tone carc, which is made up of green, brown and black. I know it's not perfect, but it's the best I could do with what I had. One disadvantage of the M1 is that it doesn't have a standard issue kettle, which is a huge disadvantage, as the crew can't have a fresh brew of the Queen's tea on the battlefield. I find that mildly disturbing. That's it from me yabbering on about a tank and some tea. I hope you've enjoyed, thank you for watching and stay safe in these difficult times.